My name is Clara, and if I could go back and whisper just one piece of advice to my younger self, it wouldn't be about investments or travel. It would simply be this: learn how to stand up for your own space. Learn how to be seen, even when it feels easier to become invisible. This is a story about how I learned that lesson far too late. It's a story about realizing you have become a weight, a burden to the people you love most, and the crushing sadness of that realization when it comes not from a sharp argument, but from a quiet shift in someone's eyes. I always prided myself on being a good mother and a good mother-in-law. I believed that love meant stepping back, offering help only when asked, and always prioritizing the happiness of the next generation. I thought silence was respect. I thought obedience was love. I was wrong. The hardest part of being unwanted is not the moment they ask you to leave. It is the long, slow, quiet journey toward that moment. It is the gradual, painful realization that you are taking up too much room, breathing too much air, and that your very existence has become a complication in someone else's carefully constructed, perfect life. For me, that realization didn't come with shouted demands or slamming doors. It came on a Tuesday morning over a simple cup of coffee when my son, Thomas, looked everywhere but at me. His gaze drifted to the window, to the pattern on the wallpaper, to the steam rising from his mug, to the floor, anywhere but into his mother's eyes. And I knew in that single crushing moment of averted attention that he was silently agreeing with his wife. I knew I was a burden he no longer wanted to carry. That day, his wife, Eleanor, had just finished explaining in the kindest, gentlest voice imaginable why the house needed more functional space and how my small room upstairs was simply too valuable to waste. She spoke of my needs: fewer stairs, easier access, but the subtext was crystal clear. We need you gone. And when I turned to Thomas, my only child, my anchor since his father passed, his silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. That silence was the answer. That averted gaze was the true betrayal. It's strange how politeness can be sharper than anger. Eleanor never raised her voice. She never used cruel words. She simply used logic and sweet, patronizing concern to dismantle my home, my space, and my dignity, piece by measured piece. And Thomas let her. Our family life, before Eleanor, was always quiet and content. My late husband, Robert, was a kind, steady man. He was a history teacher, a man who appreciated the past and respected tradition. He built our life and our modest home with the idea that it would always be a place of safety and warmth. Thomas was born late, our little miracle after years of quiet hoping. He was a serious child, thoughtful and careful, much like his father. He inherited Robert's kindness, but often struggled to find his voice. He was, and always has been, a gentle soul who desperately preferred peace over conflict. When Robert passed away suddenly from a brief illness 8 years ago, the silence in the house became huge and cold. Thomas and I leaned on each other completely. We shared our grief in unspoken ways: a shared cup of tea on the porch, a quiet evening watching old movies, a simple nod that acknowledged the empty chair at the table. Thomas promised me, right there at Robert's funeral, "I will never leave you alone, Mom. This house is your home, always." It was the strongest, most heartfelt promise I had ever heard him make, and I believed him absolutely. When Thomas met Eleanor, I was thrilled for him. He had spent so long focused on his career and on me that I worried he would never find true personal happiness. Eleanor was lovely in the most modern, glossy way. She was an interior designer, confident, articulate, and very organized. She planned their entire wedding down to the exact shade of the floral arrangements. She moved into the house 3 years ago, bringing with her a sense of direction and order that was certainly missing after Robert's death. At first, I made every effort to welcome her fully. I offered to step back from the cooking, to let her arrange the furniture, to let her feel that this was their new home, not just Thomas's old one. I tried to be the ideal mother-in-law, present enough to be supportive, but invisible enough to be non-intrusive. I truly thought I was doing well. I kept my opinions to myself. I kept my room neat and quiet. I spent my days working on my small garden and reading, leaving the rest of the house to them. But the house began to change, and with it, the atmosphere. Eleanor had a precise vision for the house. It was a beautiful vision, yes, very bright, very minimalist, very sleek. But it slowly stripped away the history, the warmth, and the comfortable clutter that made the house feel like our family home. The dark wooden bookcase Robert loved, filled with his old history texts, was moved to the dusty attic. My collection of ceramic teapots, gifts from my travels with Robert, were quietly packed away in the garage. The soft, faded wallpaper I had chosen years ago was replaced with stark, clean white paint. I would stand in the living room sometimes, feeling the hard edges of the new furniture, and wonder where the softness had gone. But when Thomas asked, "Doesn't it look wonderful, Mom?" I always smiled and said, "It's very clean, dear, very elegant." I chose my words carefully, always seeking peace, always seeking acceptance. But acceptance, I would soon learn, required my complete disappearance. The small shifts were the hardest. The way they stopped inviting me to eat dinner with them every night, making it sound like they were doing me a favor. "It's such a hassle to keep waiting for you, Mom. Why don't you just eat whenever you're hungry? We'll leave the kitchen clean for you." So I ate alone, quietly. I ate my dinner while they were upstairs or out, and I washed my own plate immediately. It felt like living in a hotel where I was the only, slightly inconvenient guest. I started spending entire weekends in my room. I would knit, read, or write letters to my sister who lived far away. I told myself I was giving them privacy, but the truth was, staying in my room was the only way to avoid that quiet, pervasive feeling of being in the way. Eleanor's disapproval was never directed at me with anger. It was always wrapped in professional concern. "Margaret, I notice you still leave the dishwasher running on that old eco cycle," she'd say, tapping her nail on the counter. "It takes 3 hours. It's much more efficient to use the fast hot cycle, even if it uses a little more energy. It makes the kitchen less occupied." I would nod, apologize, and change the setting. But every time the message was clear. My habits, my choices, my very presence were inefficient. They were making the house occupied when it should be free. The emotional distance grew wider day by day, creating a gulf between us that felt impossible to cross. I was desperate to maintain the connection with my son, but every attempt I made felt clumsy, easily dismissed, or, worst of all, instantly rejected by Eleanor. I started walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate their needs, trying to prove my worthiness. If Eleanor started dusting, I would quietly leave the room so as not to interrupt her flow. If Thomas was on a phone call, I would hold my breath in the hallway to ensure absolute quiet. But my efforts only seemed to feed the issue. My attempts at invisibility only made me more noticeable, more of a problem. The issue of the mail was a small thing, but it cut me deeply. Every morning I would get the mail and place Thomas's and Eleanor's on the kitchen counter. One day, Thomas stopped me. "Mom," he said, shifting his weight nervously, "Eleanor wants to handle the mail. She says she prefers to sort everything immediately." "Of course," I replied, handing him the stack. "I'm sorry, I should have asked." "It's fine," he rushed to say, but his face showed relief, not kindness. It was just a simple chore, but it was my chore, a small way I contributed to the household, a simple ritual I had shared with Robert for decades. When Thomas took the stack from me, it felt like he was physically removing my last meaningful duty in the house. I was being stripped of even the smallest utility. The most painful incident, before the final break, involved my granddaughter, little Rosie. She was only 4, a bright, cheerful child who loved color and mess. Rosie was Thomas and Eleanor's first child, and I adored her. I loved spending time with her, reading her stories, and playing quiet, gentle games. She was the one thing that still felt entirely mine in that changed house, a piece of unconditional joy. One afternoon, I was reading to her in the living room. We were sitting on the floor, and I was using a stack of old, colorful picture books I had saved from Thomas's childhood. Rosie was laughing, completely absorbed in the story. Eleanor walked in, surveyed the scene, Rosie sitting happily on the floor, the books spread around us, the sheer, beautiful mess of genuine interaction, and stopped cold. "Oh, Rosie," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "What are you doing? We talked about this. No toys on the floor." Rosie's face crumpled immediately. "It's all right, Eleanor," I interjected quickly. "We're just reading. We'll clean up right away." Eleanor didn't look at me. She looked at Rosie. "You need to put Grandma's books away now, sweetie. And why are you using those old, dusty things? I bought you lovely new digital books for the tablet. They are much better for your eyes." She looked pointedly at my old, worn picture books. They weren't dusty. They were loved. That day, Eleanor told Thomas that I was undermining her discipline and confusing the child with outdated methods. The following weekend, Thomas came to me. He stood in the doorway of my room, holding the stack of colorful books, my memories of him and Rosie. "Mom," he began, his voice low, filled with that familiar, miserable guilt. "Eleanor thinks it's better if you don't use the old books with Rosie anymore. She wants Rosie to stick to the educational apps." I looked at the stack of books in his hands, the books I had read to him when he was a boy, the physical manifestation of my love, once again deemed surplus. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply said, "Give them to me." I took the books and placed them carefully in a box. I taped the box shut, and then I looked at Thomas. "Does she think that my being here is confusing for Rosie too?" I asked, my voice flat. Thomas looked away again. That averted gaze, the simple, cowardly inability to look his mother in the face. It was his answer. It told me everything I needed to know. "Mom, please," he stammered, his eyes on the floor. "It's not like that. We need space." "I understand, Thomas," I said, even though my heart felt like it was dissolving into sand. It was the understanding that hurt the most, that my continued presence was jeopardizing their marital peace, that my simple love was now a disruptive force in their meticulously curated existence. After that, the visits with Rosie stopped completely. They were filled with excuses. She was napping, she was out, she was sick. I was no longer allowed to be a grandmother in my own home. I was just the quiet, dusty museum piece Eleanor wanted to remove. The emotional exclusion became physical exclusion. They started locking their bedroom door, a simple thing, but it symbolized the absolute wall they had built around their marriage, keeping me firmly on the outside. Their life was private. My life was a tolerated inconvenience. One cold night, I heard them arguing. Thomas's voice was strained, and Eleanor's was sharp, though low. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was indisguisable. I knew the subject was me. I realized then that my presence was causing him distress, not because I was doing anything wrong, but simply because I was there. I was the silent, living reminder of a guilt he didn't want to face and the past he was willing to sacrifice for his future. I walked to the kitchen and looked at my reflection in the dark window glass. I looked old. I looked tired. I looked like a problem. And I whispered to myself, they will never be truly happy while I am here. I made a decision that night, a terrible, lonely decision. To save my son's peace, I had to completely remove myself from his life. If my silence hadn't worked, perhaps my total absence would. The formal request came 2 weeks later. It was delivered not during a tense argument, but during a planned, formal discussion. Eleanor set the stage perfectly, choosing a time when Rosie was out with a sitter and making sure the living room was tidy, as if preparing for a meeting with a client. She sat opposite me on the new, firm sofa, holding a cup of tea. Thomas sat beside her, rigid and silent. "Margaret," Eleanor began, her voice soft and professional, "Thomas and I have had a very serious conversation, and we both feel that we need to address the situation here." I nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I already knew what was coming. The earlier incidents, the mail, the books, the quiet whispers, were all leading to this inevitable conclusion. "We love you, of course," she continued, "and we want you to be happy and secure. But the truth is, this house is a small space for 3 adults plus Rosie. It's creating unnecessary tension for us, and we feel it's taking a toll on your health, too. You look tired, Margaret." "You look tired." It was a gentle way of saying, "Your presence is exhausting us." "We believe," she said, leaning forward slightly, making eye contact only briefly, "that the time has come for you to transition to a more supportive living arrangement, somewhere with fewer stairs, perhaps, somewhere with more social engagement for seniors." She made it sound like I was going on a pleasant holiday. "We have even looked into a few places, beautiful assisted living residences nearby. We can help you with the deposits and the move." I kept my voice low and steady. "Assisted living? I don't need assistance, Eleanor. I am perfectly capable of caring for myself." "Of course you are," she rushed to assure me, "but it would give us, Thomas and me, the privacy we desperately need to focus on our careers and on Rosie. And it would give you the freedom to relax and socialize." I turned my head slowly toward my son. He was staring intently at the coffee table, tracing the wood grain with his finger. He did not lift his head. He did not speak. I waited. I waited for him to interrupt her, to disagree, to remind her of his promise to his father, to defend his mother. The silence grew heavy. Eleanor waited patiently, her gaze calm, the victor already assured. Finally, I spoke, not loudly, but clearly. "Thomas," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you agree with this?" His head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest, most agonizing moment. His eyes were full of unshed tears, misery, and gut-wrenching guilt, but he still couldn't speak the truth. He looked away immediately, down at the floor again. "Mom," he mumbled, his voice thick with defeat. It's the best thing for everyone. I'll still visit you every day." It was the look away that killed me, that final averted gaze that screamed, "I am choosing my peace over your well-being. I cannot look at the woman I am betraying." I didn't cry. The tears were done. In that moment, I realized that the son I raised, the kind, loyal boy who promised his father he would look after me, was gone. He had been replaced by a weary man who had simply taken the path of least resistance. I stood up, pushing myself off the sofa. My legs felt strangely light, detached from my body. "Don't worry about the residences, Eleanor," I said. "I won't be needing them." She looked surprised, then relieved. "That's wonderful, Margaret. We were worried it would be a difficult conversation." "It's not difficult," I replied. "The decision was already made for me long ago." I walked to my room. I didn't look back at either of them. I closed the door behind me and locked it. A deliberate choice, a final wall I placed between myself and the family that no longer wanted me. I didn't unpack the boxes of assisted living brochures she had given me. Instead, I pulled out my one small suitcase. I didn't pack anything new. I packed the essentials: clothes, medicine, my wedding ring, and the few precious old photos I had left of Robert. I packed the books Eleanor had deemed dusty, the ones I had read to Thomas. And I packed the box containing my ceramic teapots, the physical memories she had tried to erase. As I packed, I realized how few material possessions I truly needed. My life had shrunk to what could fit in one small piece of luggage. And yet this act of packing felt empowering. It was the first act of self-determination I had taken in years. I was finally claiming ownership of my own exit. I didn't leave that day. I needed to plan. I needed to find a job, to find a place, to find a way to escape the supportive living arrangement she had planned for me. I wanted freedom, not institutionalization. I wanted dignity, not pity. I spent the next 48 hours online researching. I was quiet, methodical, and completely focused. I found a small, cheap, long-term room for rent above a laundromat downtown. It was rough, but it was private. I transferred the last of my savings into a separate private account. I found a few leads on part-time work in a nonprofit thrift store. On the third morning, before the sun had risen, I walked out of my room, pulling my small suitcase behind me. I passed Thomas's closed bedroom door. I paused. I placed my hand on the cool wood. I wanted to say goodbye. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to tell him that his silence broke me, but I loved him anyway. But I realized that saying goodbye would only give him one more chance to avert his gaze. It would only give him one more chance to feel guilty while still choosing his wife. I wasn't leaving for him anymore. I was leaving for me. I walked silently to the front door. The house was still dark, still quiet. I gently turned the lock, opened the door just enough to slip through, and stepped out onto the cold, damp morning porch. I looked at the house one last time. It was beautiful, clean, and elegant. It looked perfect. But perfect things are often devoid of love, because love is messy and requires compromise. I closed the door behind me, very gently, not with a bang, but with a quiet, final click that sealed the end of that chapter forever. I walked down the path, my footsteps quick and decisive. I did not look back. I did not cry. I only focused on the sound of the small suitcase wheels rolling on the concrete, a sound that, for the first time in months, felt like the sound of progress. The room above the laundromat was worse than I imagined, but it was mine. It smelled perpetually of industrial detergent and heat, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the constant, relentless churning of the washing machines. It was noisy, ugly, and perfectly anonymous, and I felt a wild, liberating sense of freedom I hadn't felt since Robert was alive. I called the number for the small thrift store, Second Chances, and secured an interview. The manager, a woman named Beverly, was brisk, cheerful, and utterly unsentimental. She needed someone reliable to organize donations and manage the display window. "Can you lift 20 pounds and work 4 hours a day?" she asked. "Yes," I replied simply. "You're hired. Start Monday. Don't be late." That was it. No questions about my past, my family, or my living arrangements. Just a simple, direct transaction based on need and competence. It was exactly what I needed. My routine became my anchor. I woke up to the sound of the first industrial wash cycle. I ate simple meals in my tiny room. I worked at the thrift store, finding a strange joy in carefully sorting through the discarded items of other people's lives. The rejected clothes, the unwanted kitchenware, the old books. I was an unwanted object sorting other unwanted objects. It was a kind of strange, dark irony, but I found comfort in the meaninglessness of the work. I hadn't called Thomas. I hadn't called anyone. I was simply gone. A week after I left, I checked my phone for the first time. There were 4 missed calls from Thomas and 2 from Eleanor, one of which was a text. "Please call us, Margaret. We are worried. The house feels very strange." I deleted the text immediately. The house feels very strange. Of course it did. The problem had been removed, but the root cause, the lack of genuine connection and peace, was still there, echoing in the empty space I had left behind. I didn't call back. 2 weeks later, Thomas showed up at the thrift store. It was a slow Thursday afternoon. I was carefully folding a stack of donated blankets when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up. Thomas stood in the doorway. He looked utterly exhausted. His suit was wrinkled and his hair was messy, as if he hadn't slept properly in weeks. He looked lost. He scanned the room, his eyes wide and panicked, until they landed on me, standing by the counter, folding blankets. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Thank God. We were worried sick. Eleanor called the police, the hospitals." I stopped folding the blanket. I didn't rush to him. I didn't offer a hug. I simply stood there, my hands busy, waiting. "You shouldn't have done that," he pleaded. "You should have told me. Why did you just leave?" "I left," I explained calmly, "because you told me I was a burden, not with your mouth, but with your eyes, with your silence. I simply agreed with you." The quiet statement hit him hard. He winced, closing his eyes briefly. "I didn't mean it, Mom. I was just stressed. I was tired of fighting. Please, you have to come home. It's impossible there. Eleanor, she's not coping. We need you." He used the word need. He needed me not because he missed me, but because the perfect life he and Eleanor created immediately collapsed the moment I was no longer the convenient distraction for their underlying problems. "Thomas," I said, leaning my hands on the counter, "you need to figure out your own life now. That house is your life. I am building mine." "Building what?" he asked, waving his hand around the small, dusty store. "A job sorting old sweaters? Mom, you deserve better than this." "I have dignity here. I am respected here. I am needed here. This is mine. That house was never truly mine after Dad died, and you let them take the rest of it." He finally broke. He sank onto a nearby old floral armchair, a donation waiting to be sold, and covered his face with his hands, sobbing. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I failed you." I watched him, and in that moment, I felt neither anger nor pure forgiveness, just a quiet, settled acceptance. He wasn't the strong man I needed, but he was still my son. I walked over to him, not to comfort the man, but to comfort the boy who was lost inside him. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know, Thomas," I said. "You were trying to keep the peace, but you learned a hard lesson. You cannot save your own life by sacrificing someone else's." He cried for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and swollen, but clearer than they had been in months. "Please," he rasped. "Can I at least visit you? Can we have coffee?" "We can," I said, removing my hand, "but not at the house. We can meet at the park, or here when the store is closed." I gave him the number of my burner phone, not my main line, but a simple way to contact me. I needed to keep the walls up, for both of us. He left with an old, worn copy of a Robert Frost poetry book that reminded him of his father. He paid for it. He didn't ask for a discount. He needed the transaction to be clean. Thomas started visiting me, not every day, but once a week. We met at a small, quiet cafe near the park. We didn't talk much about Eleanor or the house. We talked about his work, about Rosie, and about the weather. Simple, necessary things. I learned that Eleanor and Thomas were going through their own difficulties now, having to face their marriage without the convenient distraction of a common problem to blame. I was not there to absorb their tension, and they were finally facing each other.
I never returned to the house. I never saw Eleanor again. I sent a simple card to Rosie on her birthday, signed only Grandma Clara, and that was the end of that chapter. My life at the thrift store and in my small, noisy room was honest. It was quiet. It was free. I made new friends, Beverly, the manager, and Mrs. Lynn, the kind woman who owned the laundromat. They were people who saw me not as a mother or a wife, but simply as Clara, a useful, quiet, and strong woman. I found a deep, profound joy in the smallest things. The smell of fresh detergent that meant my clothes were clean. The simple gratitude of a customer finding a perfect, inexpensive piece of jewelry. The ability to simply close my door and be completely, utterly at peace. Sometimes, when I wake up in the morning and hear the wash cycle starting, I remember that moment on the sofa when Thomas looked away. The moments I knew I had become a burden. And I realize now that averted gaze was the greatest gift he ever gave me, because it forced me to ask myself, if they won't look at you, if they won't fight for you, why are you still standing there? The lesson I learned late in my life is that dignity is not given, it must be claimed, and you must be willing to walk away from everything you thought you needed just to discover what you truly deserve. I deserved a space where I was not tolerated, but welcomed. I deserved a life where my worth wasn't measured by my silence, but by my strength. My life now is small. It is simple, but it is entirely my own. I finally found the quiet peace I was searching for, not in the comfort of a family that had forgotten me, but in the noisy, independent heart of a new life I built, all by myself. And that, I realized, was a victory far sweeter than any tearful reunion could ever be.